There's a strange kind of power in death. It can end dynasties, topple empires, and erase names from history. But sometimes death doesn't take power away. Sometimes it becomes the sharpest weapon a ruler can wield. There was a time, centuries ago, when a king stood in front of his entire court, draped in royal robes, and married a corpse. Not in secret, not in grief, but in cold calculation. The bride was long dead. The guests could smell the faint trace of embalming herbs under the incense. Candles flickered in a cathedral, heavy with silence. And yet, vows were exchanged, rings were placed, and a king who risked losing his crown kept it by binding himself to a body with no pulse. It sounds like a story you'd expect from some gothic horror novel, but it happened, and it wasn't the only time someone used death itself as a political shield. But let's rewind. To understand why a man would marry a corpse, you have to understand just how fragile power was in the Middle Ages. Kings didn't just sit on thrones because they wanted to, they ruled because a web of alliances allowed it. Marriage wasn't about romance, it was a contract, a way to bind families, kingdoms, and armies together. A queen wasn't just a wife, she was a treaty, wearing a crown. Break that alliance, and suddenly your enemies weren't just neighbors, they were waiting at the gates. And that's exactly where Charles II of Navarre found himself in the late 1300s. Charles wasn't a large or powerful king. Navarre was a small kingdom, sandwiched awkwardly between France and Spain, too small to truly stand on its own, too important for bigger kingdoms to ignore. His power depended entirely on his marriage. He was betrothed to Joan of Valois, a princess of the French royal family. Through her, his crown was legitimate. Through her, his throne was safe from French invasion. And then, Joan died. She was only in her 20s, a sudden illness, gone before they could officially marry, and in that moment, Charles's entire world began to crumble. Because without Joan, the French could claim his alliance was void. No marriage meant no treaty. No treaty meant Navarre was fair game. So Charles made a decision so audacious, so unsettling, that it echoed through history. He married her anyway. Joan's embalmed body was dressed in royal silks and adorned with jewels. She was placed upright on a throne in the Cathedral of Pamplona, her pale face framed by a bridal veil. Courtiers and nobles gathered, whispering behind their hands, and Charles stood before her and spoke his vows. The archbishop officiated the ceremony as if nothing was wrong. The ring was slid onto her lifeless finger. The final words were pronounced, and just like that, Charles had a wife, a dead one, but in the eyes of the law, a wife nonetheless. With that single act, his legitimacy was sealed. The marriage was binding. The dowry stayed with him. The French couldn't challenge his throne. He had taken death and turned it into a political ally. It sounds grotesque, but it wasn't entirely unique. In medieval Europe, death wasn't treated the way it is now. Today we hide it. Hospitals, morgues, private funerals. But back then, death was close. It was everywhere. The average medieval person lived in the shadow of plague. The Black Death had swept through towns, wiping out entire generations. Cemeteries overflowed. Corpses were part of daily life. Families washed and dressed their own dead. They held wakes at home. They even took portraits with them. Death wasn't just an ending, it was a presence. So posthumous marriages, marrying someone who had already died, weren't completely unheard of. They even had legal standing in some places. In France, it was called mariage posthume. If a couple was engaged and one partner died before the wedding, the survivor could still marry the deceased. It was a way to protect inheritances, secure dowries, and maintain social order. For commoners, it was usually about family. For nobles, it was about politics. Charles II just took it to the extreme. But let's pause here, because it wasn't just Europe. Other cultures had their own ways of intertwining the living and the dead. Take ancient China. There was something called ghost marriage. Families would marry off their deceased children, sometimes even arranging for two corpses to wed, to ensure their spirits wouldn't wander alone in the afterlife. In some cases, a living person would marry a dead partner to unite families or fulfill an obligation. The ceremonies were eerily similar to the living ones. Offerings, rituals, vows, just without any living bride or groom to answer back. In parts of Africa and Sudan, there was the ghost wife tradition. If a man died unmarried, his family could arrange a marriage on his behalf, and any children born to the wife would legally be considered his heirs, even if he never met them in life. And in France, believe it or not, posthumous marriage is still legal today under very specific circumstances. It was officially codified in 1959 after a dam disaster killed hundreds, including a man who had been engaged. His fiancée petitioned the president, and the marriage was granted, even though the groom was already buried. So when Charles II stood in that cathedral with his dead bride, it wasn't as alien to his time as it feels to ours. It was shocking, but it was also clever. Because, think about it, if he didn't marry Joan, his enemies would have declared Navarre illegitimate. The French king could have swooped in, claimed her dowry, and folded Navarre into the French crown. But with a single corpse wedding, Charles kept the dowry, he kept the alliance, he kept his throne. And he's not the only ruler who used a corpse to wield power. Let's talk about the Cadaver Synod. In 897, Pope Stephen VI ordered the body of his predecessor, Pope Formosus, exhumed. Formosus had been dead for months, but Stephen wanted revenge. They dug up the corpse, dressed it in papal robes, and sat it on a throne in the Lateran Basilica. A literal trial was held. Stephen screamed accusations at the rotting body, cross-examined it through a deacon who answered on behalf of the corpse, and then pronounced it guilty of crimes against the church. The dead pope's body was stripped of its garments, mutilated, and thrown into the Tiber River. It was pure political theater. Stephen wanted to erase Formosus's legacy, and he understood something important. Even a corpse has power if people believe it does. Charles II understood the same thing, and it makes you wonder how much of history is shaped not by the living, but by what we choose to do with the dead. Think of royal funerals. Even today, they're carefully choreographed spectacles. When Queen Elizabeth II died, her coffin became a symbol. The ceremony wasn't just about grief, it was about continuity. It said the crown never falls, it simply passes. The medieval mind wasn't so different, they just took it further. Charles's corpse wedding worked. France couldn't challenge him. His enemies were silenced. Navarre stayed under his rule for decades, but it also stained his legacy. History remembers him as the king who married death. A man so obsessed with power he didn't care if the bride was alive. And maybe he didn't. Maybe in his mind, she was never really a person. She was a claim, a key to survival. But there's an uncomfortable question lurking here. Was it really that monstrous, or was it just practical? Because strip away the romance, and what is a royal marriage but a contract? What is a bride or groom but a political symbol? If the symbol still works, does it matter if there's breath behind it? And in some ways, we still see shadows of this today. Think of the way famous figures are used after death. Celebrities brought back as holograms. Politicians quoted and paraded long after their passing. Even in modern media, a person's image, their name, their brand, continues to work, to sell, to influence. Death doesn't really end their usefulness. The medieval world just made that literal. Charles II's corpse wedding wasn't about love. It wasn't even about grief. It was about proving that a king could outwit death itself, at least on paper. But it leaves one last thought. If a marriage can bind two kingdoms together even when one partner is dead, if a corpse can still carry the weight of power, then maybe death isn't the opposite of politics. Maybe it's just another stage in the game. And in the end, that's the unsettling part. The king didn't marry a corpse because he couldn't let go. He married it because he refused to lose.